Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Japanese-style triple-seared steak. That's right, all these years we've been single-searing steak, when we really should have been triple-searing it. Which I know does sound like 2 sears too many. And when I heard about it, I thought it was a gimmick. But then I tried it, and it is not. It is an absolute game changer, and this easy technique produced one of the best steaks I've ever had in my life. And to get started, let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to need for these 3 sears. Starting with some coarse sea salt, or any salt, as long as it's pure, and the crystals are about this size. Oh, and we also want a dry salt. Okay, some of the coarse sea salts are like wet sand, and we don't want to use that style. But anyway, the salt sear is our first sear. At which point we're going to give our steak a bath in some Japanese whiskey, or any kind of whiskey. And yes, always make sure you sip a little first, to make sure it's still good. So sear 2 involves some whiskey, which brings us to the third and final sear, which we'll do using some nice high-quality soy sauce. And by high quality, I mean not low sodium. Okay, we want something full strength, preferably from Japan. And that's it. Other than some insanely hot charcoal, the only other thing we need for this very simple method is a nice piece of steak. And I went with this gorgeous 8-ounce filet mignon, since I think one of the keys here is to have a nice thick piece of meat. And please be very picky at the butcher shop. All right, if you're going to pay $15 for one steak, we want a perfectly trimmed center cut piece that's an entire single muscle with no membranes inside. And then because filet is relatively lean, I'm going to rub this down with a little bit of avocado oil. And by the way, some of the cool kids use duck fat or lard or tallow, but they're all going to do the same thing. And by the way, we're not starting any of this until our grill is ready, but assuming it is, once our steak is oiled and our hands are moisturized, we will cover our steak with a ridiculous amount of coarse salt, as in the entire surface, which I know does look like way too much, but it's totally necessary, and a lot of it's going to get washed off during the whiskey sear. So be brave and put on at least this much, and then once salted, we'll head to the grill and place this over our super hot coals. Okay, if you can hold your hand over those grates for more than a second or two, it's not hot enough. And what we'll do is sear this first side for about 2.5 minutes before we flip it over. And every time I've done this, a little bit of salt has stuck on the grates during the first sear. As you can see when I rotate this a half turn, which probably isn't necessary, but I do it by habit, just because charcoal fires have hot spots. So when I'm cooking a side, I like to turn it halfway through, just so the meat gets moved to a different position. But anyway, the point I was making is if a little bit of salt sticks on the grill, don't worry. Everything's going to be fine. And after 2.5 minutes, I flip that over. And as you can see, even at this early stage, during the first sear, we already have a fairly decent crust getting built up. And once that's flipped over, we'll give the other side 2.5 minutes as well. Oh, and while it doesn't have to be a filet mignon, the reason we want a thick piece of steak is so we have enough time to build up the crust on the outside without having to worry about the inside overcooking. And that's it. Once the second side's had 2.5 minutes, our first of 3 sears is complete, and we will head over to our bowl of whiskey, and we'll give our steak a nice bath. And I'm going to edit this down to save a little time, but we want to do this for at least a minute. And as I mentioned, a lot of that salt's getting rinsed off. But don't worry, there's still going to be plenty on there. And don't forget, the last sear is going to be after we toss this in the soy. And that's it. After bathing our beef for about a minute, we will place that back on the grill. And we'll repeat the exact same thing we did for the first sear. All right, about 2.5 minutes per side, giving the meat a half turn about halfway through. Oh, and because of the way it came out of the bowl, that first side we're searing probably had more whiskey on it. So what I think we should do before we flip it is use our tongs or a spoon to drip a little whiskey over the top. So that's exactly what I did, before letting that second side sear for 2.5 minutes. Oh, and this might be quicker if you just keep your whiskey and soy right next to the grill. Okay, I walked back inside for filming purposes, so you can, if you want, just do everything outside. I mean, you are, after all, the Zen master of maybe doing this a little faster. But I actually don't think it's a bad thing if our steak cools down between the sears, and that internal temperature kind of evens out a little bit. But anyway, once our second sear is complete, we will head over to our bowl of soy, and we will again bathe our beef, flipping back and forth for about a minute. And yes, this is when things really start to look good. But hang on, it gets better. and it is a little bit counterintuitive. Taking a steak with a nice crispy crust on the outside and softening that surface in a liquid. But when we take that back to the grill to complete our third and final sear, everything's going to dry out. And we will, after about 2.5 minutes per side, achieve full crustification. And as far as doneness goes, I'm going to pull this off the grill when it hits an internal temp of about 118 to 120, which after resting is going to give us something just under a medium rare, which is how I enjoy my filet mignon. Okay, for a thick cut New York strip or ribeye, I'd probably go to about 125. But anyway, you're going to be in charge of how far to go. But I really do hope you enjoy this kind of meat in a rosy pink condition. And that's it once we're satisfied with our third sear, and we've reached our desired doneness. We will head inside, where we have a couple options on how to finish this. All right, I'm going to go classic American steakhouse here and brush this with some melted butter. But I've seen people brush this with soy, or a little bit of sesame oil. But as far as I'm concerned, you can't go wrong with butter. And maybe it's different for another cut, but for filet mignon, I don't let it rest that long. All right, I think we only need like 3 or 4 minutes before we slice in, which I'm going to do now with a very sharp knife, which was actually no match for the crust. And it wasn't until I changed the angle that it sliced in. So the crust just doesn't look impressive, it feels impressive. And I was very happy to see the meat was done exactly how I wanted, which for me is a beautiful rosy pink. And once this is sliced, I'm going to go ahead and flip these pieces the other way so you can see all that internal moisture glistening. Since besides producing something ultra flavorful, this method really does work magic for the texture. I mean, come on, look at that. And I'm sorry, I just couldn't wait to plate. I just had to take that end piece and have a little chef snack, which was nothing short of magnificent. And please don't even get me started on the accumulated juices. Speaking of which, once we plate up, next to maybe a fondant potato and watercress, we will drizzle over those accumulated juices, which is the only sauce a triple-seared steak needs. And you know me, I always want a sauce, but you really do not need one here. And after you take that first bite, you will understand why. All right, the layers of umami, which is the fancy food word for intensely meaty savoriness, those layers of umami we've built up are unlike any other steak preparation I've had. I mean, I've had beautifully seared steaks before, but never one that combined this texture with this level of flavor. I mean, it really is spectacular. And now that I've used up all my adjectives, I think I'm just going to eat. And one of the funny things here is that as I was enjoying this, never once did it cross my mind that I was eating filet mignon, which I almost never ever grill, just because it is usually very lean and doesn't have as much flavor as something like a ribeye. But somehow, someway, this triple searing technique transformed it into something much more unctuous and decadent. And if you try this, I really do think you're going to be as blown away as I was. Oh, and before I sign off, I will answer the obvious question you're all wondering. Did I make a salted grilled meat old-fashioned with that leftover whiskey? Well, I tried, but it didn't work. The whiskey was just too salty. So if we're being super picky and have to find one negative thing about this, it's that we can't drink that whiskey we used. But that's fine. This has to be the greatest way to waste whiskey ever invented. So if you're okay with that, and you want to enjoy what I think is one of the greatest steaks you'll ever taste, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.